Being in transit is about movement. I work in the movies. The movies are about movement. It's all about movement. It's all about transition. When I speak to an actor, I tell them, I will cut, I will edit, unchange. When they are acting, it is their changing from one emotion to another that is the most interesting. A scene always starts out in one place and ends in another place, and that's what we follow is the movement. I think it's like movies are a kind of a metaphoric thrilling in change and in movement.
I have to move fast, because if I don't move fast, I start wandering, and therefore to get precision, like the Sundance Kid in the movie, he can shoot very precisely. Only if he's moving. He cannot sit and hit a target.
This famous editor to come in and look at my work, and he said, cut on the change. Don't cut where it's settled. Cut while it's just as it's about to happen. Make the movement the excitement.
Movement is seen as going from one place to another, rather necessarily than going through time. But that's what our lives are. Is we go through a dynamic process of change all of the time. From an Anishinaabeg point of view, change is inevitable and growth is inevitable. We see ourselves being born in coming into this world from the east. The sun rises in the east, the stars rise in the east, the moon. So our cosmology says that when our spirits come into this world, they come in with the rising of the sun or the rising of the moon. And so we always travel in that direction from east to west. And so I think as an Anishinaabeg person, I always sense myself in motion, in moving in a particular direction.
To be in transit, obviously, is to be in the unknown. And it's very difficult, I think, for any human being to be somewhere in their life where sometimes they don't know who they are anymore because they are in transit, because they're in another world or another culture that they feel outside of it and not being included in many things in life. And it's very difficult for anyone to be in that place. It takes a long time to feel you're part of something that's out of you, out of yourself. Yeah, that's what I think.
I also think that it has something to do with self-awareness. I think that whenever you have that epiphany or that all of a sudden you wake up to yourself, you need to move. You need to move. As long as you're asleep and you're not thinking, you're not self-aware, you don't go anywhere. You don't think. You don't evolve. So self-awareness is really a big part of that motion. And recognizing that as you go through life, you're going to change. We look at our physical bodies. This is something I learned in the sweat lodge, is that we look at our physical bodies and we see that we have to eat to give ourselves energy. We have to take new things in to give our bodies energy, and then we defecate. We leave the old stuff behind, the stuff that's no longer useful. Well, in the medicine circle, we do that too. So emotionally, we take new emotions in and we let old ones go. You know, we take new ideas in, we gain energy from them, and then, you know, when they're no longer useful, we let them go. And often, sometimes those ideas or knowledge can lead to you know, real sickness, because we can believe things that are not necessarily so, are not really compassionate or good thoughts. So we have to challenge ourselves and let those things go. So we're always in motion.
I hate transit authorities. I went through various transits in my life, but especially getting out of a country and getting into another one is a double transit process. You know? You have something called emigration and then immigration. I lost for a while my name, which is hard to pronounce for somebody who doesn't speak my native language. I lived in Germany, I lived in France for a while. They atrociously killed my name in pronunciation, and especially because I have two diacritics over the A's in my name. Those got lost. You know? The softs in the 80s and 90s didn't know how to transcribe that. So my transit was without diacritics. You know, these are, let's say, semicircles above the A's, which act as reversed umbrellas. You know? So the acid rain of fate usually doesn't touch you when you have your diacritics. But in this case, I had to go through the Union stations, the train stations, the plane stations, the airports, the ports, the USB ports without that umbrella, you know, until finally the prompters and the softs could finally put them back in. So I'm safe now.
Realizing that in terms of the discussion of things like language and the fact that it's very hard to talk about transitional bodies when we only have a binary language, we have he or she, and you know it's very disrespectful to call someone it, right? So the only people who do that are people who are really phobic, actually. You know, we don't have a language that reflects the current reality. And I was thinking about the fact that, you know, I had the same discussion in a science fiction class a few years ago, but from a different perspective, because they'd all read Marge Piercy's novel Woman on the Edge of Time, which imagines a future society is not of transsexuals, it's simply of people who've given up a notion of binary gender, or that there's a distinction between male and female, and so everybody is basically the same. And in order to deal with that, they've come up with a gender-neutral language. They actually use the word person. So person does this, person does that, and shorten it to per. So it's pers, right? Or it's per goat or whatever. It's actually clever because it doesn't feel as artificial as most attempts to do that sort of thing, you know? But I feel in transit a lot of the time, partly because of my accent, because nobody can ever place it, right? I've got the traces of the English accent, but if I'm in England, people say, are you Canadian? I've got traces of a Canadian accent, but in Canada, mostly people ask if I'm English. And I've got traces of an Australian accent too. So, but in Australia, people ask if I'm American usually, and then when you say no, are you Canadian, they go, "Oh, I'm so sorry."
As an only child of two parents who were Peace Corps volunteers, I think that my parents really strove to have me have contact with many different cultures and many different experiences. So I think for a very young age I was exposed to a lot of different cultures, did a lot of travel.
Created the first major waves of political emigration. So people were forced into exile in large numbers because of their political affiliations, and they were sent to places which they wouldn't necessarily have chosen to go, and to a life condemned to a sense of a life on the road, again they wouldn't have chosen. Transit more recently would suggest for me transit camps, which in many ways make concrete this notion of transit, insofar as they give specific sites to the practice of transit.
images of people who are not yet citizens, images of people who are on the brink of citizenship or who are hoping to attain citizenship. And the kinds of images that I look at are of people in transit between states. Specifically, I've been looking at images of Chinese immigrants on these things that were called hetak certificates. So between 1885 and 1923, thousands of Chinese immigrants came to Canada, and each one of them had a photograph taken after 1910. So after 1910, every single Chinese immigrant who came to Canada had a photograph taken, and they were recorded. Their entry, their moment of transit was recorded for the state. What is amazing and moving to me about these pictures is the consistency of their emotional expression in these pictures. So I looked at a couple thousand of these photographs, and I find them extremely moving, of these immigrants who are in transit and in between states, have very little expression, and they are almost emotionless. And it felt to me, and it seemed to me, that these were people who were trying to perform or model what an ideal citizen subject would look like in the moment when they are in transit, in the moment in which they are in between the protective sort of boundaries of the nation state. And I think that there's something really important about marking and slowing down how we think about those instances of being in between a culture, in between a state, in between the space of migrant and citizen, for example. And what's very difficult and powerful for me about these images is how much they try to erase a certain kind of individuality, so that these photographs tend to be incredibly standardized. The immigrants themselves try to look like everyone else. And what I find very moving then about that is how there's a certain kind of quieting of the self that happens in transit, in the moment in between states.
Well, as a member of the community, it's the same thing. For anybody who leaves, it's difficult to in the everyday life, because you're always an outsider. So, and that's a transition within yourself. And especially if you haven't been given a place to belong and to know your history and to stand strong on your 2 feet, because once you do know who you are and feel it's good and it's all right to be that, then you can go anywhere, and it's much easier than to be somewhere you know where. So I think the best way to feel strong, and I'm sure that's not the only answer, but it's certainly one of them, that is to find out as much as you can about yourself, who you are, where you come from, what's your history, what's your language. Then you can walk everywhere.
I, at very, very young, I was sort of, sexually undefined in a way, and not undefined, but I was, born into a straight family and assumed I would be straight and loved women. And do I tell the world that, or do I not tell the world that? So I much of my hiding, and I think some of my work even suffered a little bit because of such a need to hide. But by nature, I'm someone who loves to be just what I am and open and speak the truth. So over my lifetime, I have kind of come to be comfortable with a complete transparency, as life is far too short, and I feel like I moved from like this medieval worldview and lifestyle and set of assumptions rapidly through history, and now I'm working in one of the most technologically complicated media and making movies in a world that has all the rules, and I'm an example of one who's changed rapidly from ancient assumptions to now 21st century polymorphous perversity, or no, that's not. From ancient assumptions to a kind of world of acceptance that there's room for everybody. There's room for everybody.
I have no idea what the time frame is.
I get the impression that transit, paradoxically, has become actually rooted in certain places. Rather than being an activity which suggests constant movement, it actually suggests, in a way, stasis, the opposite of transit. And also, transit suggests a stripping of your rights. This is something which could be found in the 18th century, but which again is now seen as, I think, a much more essential part of the notion of being in transit.
Well, I find transit to be a neutral term. It is descriptive. We are passerbys in life, as the New Testament encourages us to be. Transit in general is one of the words that permits everything. It permits immorality. For instance, well, I had to kill her, no, but I was just in transit. It is a lack of responsibility. You know, as Kierkegaard was saying, we moderns like to have power without responsibility. When we have power, we are stable. And in general, we are holding on to our chair. But not to have responsibility is a way of saying that we are in transit with respect to the others. So maybe modern life is predicated on this static throne as opposed to the mobile sort of not taking hold or not taking charge. But probably you got this answer many times about modern society being a society of commuters, of tourists, of transhumans, where nomadism is impossible because everything has been decided to be sedentary, and we are, even in our lives, some sort of tourists, you know, as if always the return to the point of departure is granted. I suppose that this is a boring way of spending your life, you know, trying to follow the non-existing rules of the phantomatic or imaginary majorities. Everybody is touristy, you know, from that point of view.
When I was a little girl, it was so difficult that talk about transit. Everything about me was transit. So, but I didn't understand why it was happening to me. If I had known, and if I could have gone to school and learned my history and good things about my own people, it would have been very different. This is why I've done all the work I've done all these years to change that. And it's very hard. Like, some people die from it, you know, they're just so rejected and made to feel that they don't count. And that's for all people, not just us, for all people. And once you understand all that, it's possible to go further, to not allow it so much to damage you. But all that takes a long time. It doesn't happen overnight, you know.
I'm constantly embracing that word, movement and transition. But when I say this scene has no movement, this character has no movement, that's when it's not working. So we are only most alive when we are in a state of change. and change involves disorder, and it involves dis-ease, like unease. So when you're uneasy, when you're uneasy, when you can't find the pillars, that's when you're most alive and growing most.
Don't ask me what author I like too many. Don't ask the painter what color he or she likes. No, it's not a fair question. When it comes to great transit literature, as opposed to travel literature and so on, I like to think that Homer was not an individual, blind or bald. I like bald people. But really that Homer himself did not exist. That Homer was the name, maybe a collective name, of a band of bards in Greece, somewhere in the 8th century BC, who were telling stories, who were telling lies to various islands in the archipelago or in the cities and maybe villages of the peninsula. Now, that transiting authorship of an oral culture that we don't know anymore, our memory is so much fading today because we have all the data banks, all the props to depend on. But that sort of multiple or collective creation, collective both in co-presence or synchronically and in time, because orality changes in time, that is a good example of transit literature for that sort of culture. Then, again, at a non-personal or transpersonal level, I'm thinking of the stories of the Arabian Nights. Stories which came to Europe late, they came from Arabic, obviously, but the stories themselves come from the Persian stock. Something was happening in ancient Persia, with both words and numbers, with chess and other things. It is a space of invention. But those stories, the amazing stories, which are framed within frames, that Shahrazad is telling in order to survive another night, those are wandering stories. And that sort of wandering informs, if you want, a great flux, a flux really of stories. We don't have much more than stories. Stories are important. Of those stories that migrate from the Persian mountains to the Arabian desert and then over the seas, making maybe into Arabic Spain, and from Spain are told to many children. And when we're not children anymore, we have to reread the Arabian or the 1001 Nights in order to remember how to be a child, even if we're not Arabic or Persian. And that sort of community, the koine of storytelling, that wonderful transit that puts together distant spaces and times, seems to me to be a good example of transit.
In transit, I think of movement, I think of change, I think of motion. It's very dynamic to be in transit. I look at the role of literature in the promotion and the emergence of musical theater in the late 19th century and the early 20th century in Spain, and also in Spanish America. So I'm looking at works of zarzuela and opera that are based on works of literature. So they can be based on novels, they can be based on poetry or theater. And I'm also looking at the collaborations between writers, librettists, and composers in the creation of these works. Fundamental to my study is obviously how literature changes when it goes from one genre, the literary, to the musical, and how literature changes when it's written into the libretto form and is performed. Okay? Mm-hmm. And not only that, but how it's received by audiences and how these works move in the Spanish-speaking world. So the movement of these works on both sides of the Atlantic and through different countries and how audiences receive them. So I think that adaptation, change, movement is fundamental to the research that I'm currently doing. My favorite examples from my research project, which is it's a Spanish-American epic poem, so it's a very long poem called Tabaré by an Uruguayan writer Juan Soria de San Martin, and he went to Spain in 1892 to partake in the celebrations at that time for Columbus's first transatlantic voyage in 1492. He read his poem at a series of cultural events, and attending one of these events was a Spanish composer who was very much enraptured by this reading of this poem. And this Spanish composer eventually asked for permission after going himself and traveling to Spanish America in 1910 during the sort of 100-year celebration of the initiation of independence in Spanish America. He asked the author for permission to use that work as a basis of Spanish opera. And by using a work of Spanish American literature, he's using it to reflect on the Spanish nation more at that particular period of time. So it's a good example of national and transnational identities. It's an example of writers from different countries, different emerging identities working together and creating an artistic project, an artistic object, a performance that reflects on both traditions. I think it's also an interesting case because that work was constantly in the future down the line being reformulated, reperformed, replayed. So again, just in terms of movement, change, motion, adaptation, these works are not stagnant. They're very much alive, and they very much continue to be very much present, I would say.
As to authors, let me invoke Borges, because Borges is a man who was born in Buenos Aires, and then he lived in Switzerland and in Spain. He returned to Buenos Aires, and he became a central market inspector and a librarian as he was slowly going blind, and then he became famous and he started traveling. You know, he had plane tickets. You know? But until then, in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, Borges's literature is, from his essays and poems to his great fictions, it's a literature that covers almost all the world. Always the instability of the Borgesian texts, the fact that they may tell a truth but we are never sure about it, that he's a brilliant liar because he's just on the margins of truth or beauty or heroism or maybe even the idea of the self or the character. He's always on the margins of this, as if he were a halo or adding a halo to whatever we have in a story. Traveled from the Icelandic Eddas to the Chinese Fox fantastic stories, and it went into all the Western traditions and made immortal people be really bored and forgetful of their own immortality. That would be a good example of transit, because if transit stops at a certain point for the transiting person, it means that death has arrived. That everybody in the post-transit era, like in a post-coital era, lives on a pension plan. And the pension plan is depleted cell by cell, buck by buck, until something called the funeral occurs. But the others are in charge of that.
Right, yeah, right, and then as to how I'm going to organize, because I don't want.
And in science fiction, of course, issues of sexuality are constantly, in that sense, in transit. You know, how will we live in the future? How might we live if we developed spaceflight? How might we live if we encountered alien races? How might we live, you know, there's any number of possibilities that you can posit and ask a lot of questions about. And so you have that sense, too, of sexualities and genders also possibly being kind of in transit between what they are now and what they might become. And all we can ever do around that is speculate, right? In society generally, but specifically the kinds of work that I'm looking at. I mean, science fiction authors, I think, very often are kind of ahead of the theoretical trends. I think, you know, you see them anticipating ideas that then become standard parts of something like postmodernism. So, you know, I feel like as a theoretician, I'm always kind of playing catch-up to the authors that I'm looking at. That's less the case with film. I think science fiction film is very much of the moment. It's about the ideas that we have now. And so it's kind of behind the curve in terms of being relative to what people are writing. And that's partly because, I think, of the technology of what you can imagine. But it's also partly because of, a kind of conservatism within cinema in terms of, you look at a book like, and this is a book that's very much kind of about being in transit, Ursula Le Guin's Left Hand of Darkness, which she wrote in 1967, I believe. Or maybe that was 1969. I'm never very good with dates. And, there's a book about someone from Earth, the future Earth, who arrives on a planet where people have, they're basically hermaphroditic. So they're both male and female. But most of the time they're kind of neuter. And a lot of it is about passages. It's about transitions. And the transition he makes physically mirrors the transition he makes ideologically. So, it's a book that's really about being in transit. But it's also a book that nobody's made an attempt to film, really. I think there was an attempt maybe 3 or 4 years ago. People were talking about adapting it. But, you look at one of the great classic science fiction novels that's all about really interesting and transitional ideas, and it hasn't actually, been adapted, whereas, some of the more, in a sense, conservative things have, like Starship Troopers. And then, of course, people's obsession with Philip K. Dick, where I think everything is constantly in transit because you can never fix reality down.
But really to realize that you are in transit and not on this or that point of a fixed course that can be either linear, going from A to B and then back to A, or being circular somehow. The interesting point is when the circuit breaks and when you don't recognize the places where you are in, or you don't recognize yourself. This enhances the spirit of adventure, a spirit that we have lost. Our imagination today, even the imagination of what transit means, has weakened its powers. There are other powers that take hold of us and tell us that imagining the world otherwise, through change, adventure, revolution, or really a massive change, is futile, because tous les jeux sont faits. All the dice have been cast. So transit as such, as let's call it a postmodern phenomenon, has become sort of a minor swarming of many bodies at times when demographics, with its inscrutable logic, it's taking hold of all of its members. I prefer to transit well from book to book and from topic to topic, from country to country, because if I don't move, I'm going to become a wandering mind.
And the literature, I think, is very much about, or the better literature at any rate, is very much about how we're constantly in transit because we're moving from one set of ideologies to another, one set of social circumstances to another, one set of technologies to another, one set of scientific knowledges to another. So we're constantly having to adapt, and how do people react to that? How do they live within that set of circumstances is very much the concern of people who write. And so I think because they're imagining what might happen in the future, they're always a little bit ahead of the curve, and whereas people who are people who we look at in terms of theorists are very much about what's in the now to some extent, rather than imagining the future. So there's a kind of gap.